Thank you all very much. Thank you, Emer, and the West Cork Literary Festival for asking me to host this. It's my great pleasure. I suppose there's an element of trying to figure out the weirdness and excitement of this as well. So it's almost like a journey into the unknown again. And it's funny because Rónán's first event, as a writer was here, so it's great to welcome him back. Rónán Hession is a musician with 3 albums under his belt under the name Mumbling Deaf Row. And his 2019 debut novel, Leonard and Hungry Paul, was selected this year for the One Dublin, One Book by Dublin UNESCO City of Literature. And it was one of the Sunday Times great Irish novels of the century. And we're delighted to welcome him back for his new novel Panenka. And I'd like to invite Rónán to read a bit from it.
Thanks very much, Don, and thanks, Emer, and thanks to the festival for having me. So I'm going to read just a short opening section from Panenka. The first page, which just opens the book. So chapter 1, Panenka. His name was Joseph, but for years they'd called him Panenka, a name that was his sadness and his story. These past months, the pressure pain in his head had been coming almost every night, building like an Atlantic wave that roiled within his dreams until it broke and crashed through his sleep, shocking him awake. It manifested as a clamp on his face. Working at bone level, it would spread from the crease between his eyebrows, around the orbits of his pounding eyes, and onwards to his jaw, which would stiffen and lock with tension. He called it his iron mask. With the palms of his hands pressed against his cheeks, he would run to the bathroom to compress his face against the cool, hard side of the bath, barely relieving the nerves that had Mayday signals pulsing through them. In its own time, and on its own terms, the iron mask would eventually lift, allowing the last few ripples of pain to subside, and returning Panenka to the unclaimed hours somewhere between late night and early morning. Exhausted, he would haul himself up, his legs all fizzy and useless, and limp back to bed, thinking hungrily about the few hours of sleep that remained. Pulling the duvet up as far as his cheek, which bore no bruises or scars, no evidence of the silent violence, he would catch a bubble of thought passing through his mind. Was this time worse or the same as the last? Was the pain spreading or different? But he had learned to ignore these questions. The iron mask was unknowable in any real sense, and beyond any bargaining. Thank you.
We were talking beforehand about scheduling in terms of how the pandemic has affected the whole literary industry among many other industries. But I was kind of interested because to me this seems to be coming very quickly on the heels of Leonard and Hungry Paul. How did it affect you? Because it seems like it hasn't.
Yeah, I in terms of writing, I spent a lot of the pandemic. I did read a lot, and I did sort of focus on my writing. So I made good progress. Panenka wasn't written when Leonard and Hungry Paul came out, so it wasn't a sort of a top bedside drawer plan B, that I had to dust off and get out. So I had to work on it. And when Leonard and Hungry Paul sort of first came out, it was kind of difficult to have 2 books in my head, because I found, particularly with dialogue, when you're dealing with the sort of relationships, when I was writing about Panenka and the woman he spends time with, Esther, I kept slipping back into Leonard and Shelley territory. The jokes would kind of go in a sort of goofy direction. So I had to set it aside. But from a writing point of view, I didn't find the pandemic disruptive in that way. I felt quite calm in my writing, and I felt that normally before I start a book anyway, I'll have a very strong sense that it's ready, and that's just, it needs to sort of take form. So I just tapped into that, really.
There's a strong sense for me anyway in Panenka or Joseph that there's elements of Leonard and Hungry Paul in him, almost these 2 different characters. There's the very quiet, kind of self-contained guy, and the guy who's open and curious. Was there a sense of kind of exploring different facets to a single character when it came to Panenka?
Yeah, very much so. I think with my style of writing, which is very much sort of vignette style, one of the things I like to do is to put the character into settings with different characters. So you almost cycle Joseph or Panenka through a range of different characters, and in that sense, we get to see different sides of him. So it's not that I don't try and write characters that they are a particular way. I don't sort of design them and then have them just evidence certain behaviors throughout the book. What I like to do is to start with a character who doesn't really understand themselves, and then to see what other people draw out of them. And I think that's one of the big things in the book is the question of, on the one hand, you have a man who has very much internalized what has happened in his life, and it shows, I suppose, in a way, the social side to human nature, that you can't always solve all your own problems yourself. You need to be around people who turn up or draw out certain aspects of your personality, and that's what happens to him. He goes through that sort of change and actually gets a sort of better sense of self-awareness, I think, through it.
Is that a challenge as a writer to start with a character who doesn't really understand himself, or is that the way, as a writer, you approach all characters? Who are these people? Do they know themselves? Who do I think they are? Who do they think they are?
Yeah, exactly. I think what I like to try and, rather than sort of work towards a very sort of plot-driven narrative arc where it's going to land in a particular way, I like to think of it's more like a dimmer switch that just gets brighter. So the reader understands the character better, the characters understand themselves. And I like that sort of sense that you have a person in transition, that what the book is really doing is taking a character who is in one particular state and they're in a process of moving to another state, and how that happens. And that's a very sort of rich part of insight, I think it can be, for an individual themselves, but also in terms, as a reader, I like to see that, because people are very quick to sort of settle into an identity. Once they identify with something, their circumstances, their history, their own story about themselves, it's very hard to penetrate that. But we're in that sort of transition between one state and another. They really are open for business in a very brief way. And I really try and focus on that. And both books sort of have that, I think.
So when you first encountered Panenka, what did you understand about him? What defined him for you?
I think there were a few things that came together and sort of manifested as Panenka as a character. One, I think I sort of observed, and a lot of these things are things I think about anyway. You know, I don't think about them to write about them. They're kind of in my head for a long time. I sort of observed that a lot of people are quite hard on themselves, that a lot of people seem to have aspects of themselves that they either don't like or don't forgive, and that people find it very hard to move on. You know, I'm 45 now, so I know lots of people my age who are still processing what happened in the first 18 years of their lives, or the first 10 years of their lives.
Or 40.
Yeah, or 40. Or, well, even, you know, mathematically, if I'm lucky, I'll have another 45, you know, at most. If it takes you 45 years to process 10 years, you're not going to really catch up with your life. So how do you solve that problem? How do you solve that? And in Panenka, really, it's a question of trying to dig into that and not knowing the answer when you start. So Panenka as a character came together through two main influences, I think. One is I had read an interview with Daniel Timofte, who's the Romanian footballer who missed the penalty against Ireland, where that was in about 2015, where it was supposed to be a light-hearted interview, saying, you know, that was 25 years ago, you know, it was with Packy Bonner, it was like, that was you know, Roddy Doyle, you know, street parties in Ireland, that was a great time. And he had actually had a lot of sadness in his life since then. The other thing is I saw a documentary about Henry Marsh, who is a British neurosurgeon, who, it's called The English Surgeon, it's on YouTube actually, and he spends his summer holidays working pro bono in the Ukrainian health system. And he says their system is about 60 or 70 years behind the NHS. So he's going over there dealing with people who have very, very difficult conditions, very limited resources, very limited skills. And there's some very moving scenes when he has people in his office where he's talking to the Ukrainian doctor in English in front of a patient who doesn't speak English. And he's basically saying to them, within the next year or two, this beautiful young woman will go blind and die. How do we tell her that? So it's a very moving documentary. So as often happens with creative projects, it takes a braiding of two sort of unlikely ideas. And that's really, I had those two things just carrying with me without any intention of doing anything with them. And they just combined really into Panenka's story.
It's interesting you mentioned Tomofty, because he's a footnote really in all our colourful memories of that time. And I suppose that's the thing with a lot of characters who kind of fail publicly. And in a greater story, you know, they're almost like a meme, you know, or kind of a shading to the joy. And yet, you know, it's this little cloud that no one sees. And when you say that a lot of people aren't kind to each other, was it specifically that interview with Tomofty, or had you just noticed this in life anyway, that kind of people are generally kind of a bit hard on themselves?
It was a general thing. And I'm told, I haven't travelled, I've been, you know, to Japan, but I haven't travelled wide in the Far East. But I know a lot of people who spent a lot of time there, and they say they've observed that doesn't seem to be as common. And I don't know whether it's a cultural thing or focus in the West on individualism, you know, breeds that in people. There's so much pressure on you as an individual that how can you live up to yourself? But it sort of gave me sort of just a question when I'd observed the amount of sort of, and in Panenka's case as well, or even say Daniel Tomofty's case, or any similar stories, the football is a hook really rather than the full story. It's really a question of how it becomes internalized. You know, Panenka in the book, whatever he suffers or goes through in terms of his past, it's largely his internal treatment of it, his acceptance of his failures and self-punishment that just digs a deeper groove for himself. And it's interesting, just as I know people over time, there are so many people I know where when they get into that more personal moment and they confess, I know their story about themselves. You can see that it's been repeated over and over again, and is almost verbalized, not to get it off their chest, but to get it validated. And that's a trap. So I wanted to try and see, well, I've no idea how a person works their way out of that. It's a bit like quicksand, where you know you try and pull yourself up, you get deeper. So how do you deal with that? So the book was really an exploration of that. How do you reset your life?
Panenka, of course, if you know people who are familiar with football, it's a style of penalty taking where it's kind of audacious. There's an audacity to it. It's not a hard kick or a kind of to a corner. It's, you know, the idea is you outside the goalie. The goalie moves first, and you just nonchalantly toss it, kind of chip it right into the middle, and it's a kind of humiliation, you know, for the goalie. But you know, this is the character, and was it clear as a result of Tomofty that you kind of thought, I'm writing about a football player, or did you always want to write about a football player?
I certainly have been in love with the Panenka for a long time.
Yeah.
You know, the first ever Panenka is 1976. So, but when I was, as part, you mentioned One Dublin, One Book, I did a music event as part of that. And somebody tweeted an old music interview I'd done from 2012, where I was asked, when you go down a YouTube wormhole, what do you look at? And in the interview I said, I look at Panenka penalties. And every time I walk down a corridor, if I walk down this corridor, when I get to the end, I will mentally take a Panenka into the open marquee before I just turn off into the gents or whatever.
And it goes in every time.
Every time the keeper, and
a little.
all my imaginary goals go in. But so I'd always been fascinated with what it's named after the original player who took it for the first time and invented the technique and who gambled his whole country's sporting success on it. So it struck me just as a good capsule, really, of where an individual takes a decision on behalf of everybody and it goes wrong. And one thing that was on my mind for many years, and about 10 years ago maybe, or a bit less, I read Disgrace by J.M. Coetzee. And I thought, what a good idea for a book, the idea of disgrace. But it wasn't the book I thought it would be. because in that book, the person who gets disgraced deserves it. But I was interested really in what happens when you don't deserve it. What happens when it just becomes a phenomenon around you. And you're right what you say about people who publicly fail in that the general public don't really care about it. But it's just the one thing they associate with you. And that can stop you moving on. And because it's unfixable, a big thing in the book is life's unfixability. When we have problems in our lives, when we have problems with the people in our lives, you try and work out, our mentality is very much to diagnose it and to solve it. Well, what if it can't be solved? And that's a big feature of life. I think as you get older, you become more aware of that, because sometimes the people may have passed on, or they're not in your life, or they're not, there's nothing you can do about it. So you can't sort of restore the equilibrium. So you have to find a new starting point. And that was a big part of it as well.
The moment, the penalty in the book, it's the centerpiece in a lot of ways, and it's written brilliantly because we know he's a tortured man, so we know there's failure in his life. But you're hoping, willing, believing he is going to score that penalty. And how long did you take crafting that whole kind of scene?
I think probably the biggest decision was where to put it in the book. I didn't want it to be the culmination of the book. I didn't want to be a sort of what people would expect from a football book, which is that it all builds up to the big occasion. So I think putting it in the sort of the bang in the center means that there's always a question, I think, when you do books where you split time periods, when do they come together? And in this case, I thought it was really, and I experimented where to put it. I think putting it in the middle means that you sort of get to a point where you're sort of done with the backstory. And the question is, now what? But the actual writing of it was kind of fun. I enjoyed that. And, I played football for a long time and watched football for a long time. So to try and write that as a sort of mini piece of sports writing without getting too effusive about it. But I'm conscious like that, football and books don't always mix. In a way, I think writing a book with football in it is a Panenka. You know what I mean? It's a gamble that could pay off brilliantly or could go terribly wrong.
Why do you say that?
Well, because I think there's a resistance to the idea of sport in books. It's almost like, when Pangea separated the continents, all the football people ended up on one plate, and all the book people ended up on the other. And it's been interesting. People who like the book say, "Well, I hate football, but I still liked it," almost to reassure other readers, "Don't be put off." Yeah. And I think I'm interested in the reasoning behind that. Some of it's just different crowds, but also some of it is, I think there's a class element why football is absent. I think from a lot of, you would think, like, as a sport, roughly half of the world's population are football fans. Right? There's over 3 billion football fans. But if future sort of archaeologists were to just find, the only thing they could find of human civilization was a bunch of shelves said marked fiction A to Z, and they said, okay, we're going to try and reconstruct it, and they would say, but the vast majority of humans were creative writing teachers who slept with their students. That's basically how this society worked. And they would hardly know sport existed. So I kind of feel there was a sort of gamble in that, and there was a test for me to sort of, with the trust of the reader, to say, well, look, you don't have to, this is really a human story, it's a human nature story, and to try and write it that way. In the same way that Leonard and Hungry Paul, ghostwriting children's encyclopedias is Leonard's job, playing football is Panenka's job. So I always like to put the work of the character, really central in the books.
There's a strangeness about Seneca FC. The name even feels, no one knows of Seneca FC, and it feels like it belongs to a different town than the town, which the town doesn't have a name, and yet we have normal names in it: Esther, Vincent. But Seneca is almost like this weird wonderland, like something mythical, because you have characters in it like Darvich and Giuliani, and of course the manager, César Fontaine, you know, it feels like it's Ireland, but these characters, you know, it feels like it's some weird kind of almost somewhere Mediterranean. That slight kind of oddness about it, you know, why did he create that? That there's no one recognizably, that it just feels odd, you know.
Yeah, I suppose, I do sort of feel that football clubs are like that. They're international things. And I do feel that I wanted to create a sort of sense of a town that doesn't have much going for it, that's around the club, that it didn't have a particular, you know, obvious geographical location. And you can't tell a lot about a football team by the names of the players, you know, because they come from everywhere. And much more so in the last 30 years than before. And also, I think there's always, you know, footballers, there's always been this kind of link between footballers and philosophers. You know, like Socrates, Emerson. You know, there's always been that connection. Albert Camus played football.
Monty Python.
Monty Python. Yeah. So I kind of wanted to have sort of that, to tap into that sort of side to football that there is. And I know in the US there's a very strong tradition of sports writing, which is quite deep thinking, and I think the Guardian has probably, and the Telegraph have done that, you know, more in the UK. But yeah, I didn't want it to be particularly Irish or particularly anywhere, and you know, that it would have, whereas Leonard Hungry Paul wasn't set anywhere, it had a kind of definite sort of suburban sort of feel to it. I wanted this to sort of feel, to give the town a personality, but not to put it anywhere, and to have just a slightly international sort of flavour that comes with football.
And of course, the manager, César Fontaine, is such a fascinating character. He's very recognisable. You know, there's something kind of the philosophy of nurturing the man rather than the football player. Were you thinking of anyone in particular?
I had he's an amalgam of different people I've known, and then football managers. I suppose the Argentinian manager Menotti, who was a Marxist, you know, smoking with his long hair and would talk very deeply. I'm a Watford fan. Graham Taylor, you know, had a very strong sense of community and his philosophy. And I've had football managers over the years who were all like that.
Yeah.
There used to be a guy, James Sherlock was his name, and he was a big Leeds fan. He'd like, hey, right, I want you to be Gordon Strachan today. Right, this is my vision for the club. Like, and this is like an under-14s football team where we're just driving to Blanchardstown for a match. Like, there's no need for any overlay of philosophy. But I like that sort of, this sort of sense of, because it's a very personal thing actually if you're a manager, your relationship with players. I think it's about Leonard Hungry Paul in this book. There is an exploration of the different types of male relationships, and it's a very, very special relationship between a footballer and their manager. You know, it's a mentoring, it's a father figure role, and yet both of you will go through failure together. And you will go through that quite deeply with different people. And so I wanted to try and have that. I don't know, I wouldn't say it's universal, but I think for a lot of men, you can just have a father figure outside the home who's very important to you. And it could come from unexpected places. So I just wanted to try and capture that César Fontaine is a man who, a flawed, but nevertheless inspiring sort of person. And the way he fits into, in a way, you know, Panenka sort of is a sort of shock absorber for his reputation as well.
And of course, as a Watford fan, you're intimately familiar with feelings of suffering and, you know,
exactly
failure. You know.
So a lot of that dialogue didn't take a huge amount of imagination. You know, I always, you know, when I hear, you know, English fans saying, you know, coming home and it's been 30 years of hurt or whatever since 1966, I'm like, well, picture never winning anything. You know, or I have friends who are, you know, Liverpool fans, and they get upset about not qualifying for the Champions League. I'm like, you spoiled little baby. You know what I mean? You've never been relegated. You know what I mean? You know, and of course they hardly go to matches as well. That's the thing. People follow big clubs. They don't. They're Sky Sports football fans mostly. So yeah, it's a Watford. I think Camus said something like everything he learned about disappointment and failure he learned from football. So it's like there is something you go through, and I do think the most intense day of the season is the relegation battle. I think relegation is much more intense than victory. you know. So I think that's and Watford have given me lots of practice at that particular occasion.
You talk about, you know, in terms of the manager, this idea of kind of male friendship, you know, or mentorship as well. And, you know, Leonard and Hungry Paul was about male friendship, but this is about so many different other levels of friendship, you know, in terms of male friendship, casual friendship, romantic. There's a lot of different avenues here. You know, when you're starting off with the character Panenka, you know, there's his whole personal life, but by extension, you know, there's, you know, his daughter, his grandson, you know, in terms of their relationships as well. Did that all arrive fully formed in terms of their own backstories as well?
Yeah, I certainly didn't want it to be too blokey a book. You know, and I think the female characters, his ex-wife Lauren, his daughter Marie-Therese, are a huge part of the book, and Esther, of course, in terms of the second half of the book. And I like relationship books. I like the softness of that in books. And I think there are, you know, many sort of Dulux shades, you know, in terms of relationships. But we kind of, a lot of times in literary fiction, go to the primary colours. You know, like it's just male-female romantic sexual relationship, or just pure friendship, or, you know, people who hate their parents. So it's trying to just play with that a little bit. And definitely, I think the grandparent relationship, I think, is really interesting to explore, because it gives an insight into, I often think it's a shame people aren't grandparents first and then become parents, because people seem to be good at grandparenting and they like it. And then they could take what they learned from that into being a parent, whereas, you know, parenting... A
test drive. Kind of,
yeah. And I think it's the fact that you don't really feel you have to fill the role of a grandparent. You can just let kids away with murder. And actually, you can let them away with murder and it doesn't actually spoil them most of the time. And also, I think in the male-female relationship, like probably the biggest part of the book, and in terms of you ask about the backstory, where did they come from? Esther was the hardest character to get. You know, I do think that there was something missing on the spectrum in relationships between men and women, something of the nature of sort of loving friendship. You know, and there are many reasons why it's easy to understand why that's difficult to have in real life. But I do think it is a sort of, that there is a place for that. And I do think there is in Esther, when she first came to me as a character and I started trying to find her, there's sort of a frequency range you locate the characters in. And she was in a very, very specific frequency range. And I always had to listen to particular songs just to get me in there and to get her established and what her relationship, because so many little bits of body language, references, could easily tip that into too much on the romantic or too much into just distance, and just to keep her there was very, very difficult. So that's and like with all characters, it's iteration. It's you write them, rewrite them many, 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 many times, and eventually they settle into where they're meant to be.
So what did go into Esther? Because I think, you know, in terms of what you were trying to absorb, you know, because she is a fascinating character, and there's kind of, you know, so many kind of new things revealed about her, you know.
Well, I think she is also somebody who carries some pain from her past. She has that in common with Panenka, and that's where the sort of resonance between their relationships happens. But she's handled it differently. And she has a certain resilience or perseverance or determination to restart her life. And she doesn't know if that's the right way to go about it. But there is just something that Panenka learns from that. And she still has that openness. She just says, she just sort of stare at people and she trusts people. She has that sort of, she's retained a certain, I don't want to say childlike innocence, because that's not quite right. She's retained a certain faith in people. She hasn't let her disappointments that really have become the story of her life sour her interest in life. And I think it's very important, that's a very important side to her. She has a sense of humor and there's a playfulness there, but it's not a sort of giddiness. It's a more mature, she's around 40-ish, the book says. So she's not she's not just flirting, she's not just, everyone loves the first stage of a relationship in real life and in books and in movies. It's lovely and everyone loves that. But to some point, these are not people who are starting at that stage. They've been through too much. So just to try and get her to match Panenka in that they're both curious about each other and neither is really sure what it is or what to call it or how to handle it. And to try and just establish that. And that was really just, I think a big part was just trying to get what's the right level of sort of hurt versus sort of faith in life for someone like Esther. That's the key thing in her, I think.
You said, let's say starting point was how do you handle failure or some big moment like that. But I think under the surface are these constant questions about relationships. How do we open ourselves up to people? How do we kind of find a way into people? How do we allow people into us? And it's a constant kind of, there's constant thoughts and kind of reflections by many of the characters, about this, that, even in the way the expressions you use in the book, are just slightly kind of turned around in a way in terms of it's not, I loved her, or something, she was the person I loved, or things like that, or, it really puts the question back on the characters in terms of, well, what does this all mean and how do we allow each other, open to each other,
Yeah, and I think like Marie-Therese, for example, who's Panenka's daughter, and they were estranged, when his life fell apart, he went into himself, and that affected his role as a father to her. And she has a question, really, she's kind of brought him back into her life without really having a plan for what to do about it. And so there's unresolved pain for her, but at the same time, she does want a relationship, and she can kind of rationalize it a bit, but she has that question, as you say, of what's the sort of balance here. I think all of them are trying to find that biting point. It's kind of like a hill start, where you're trying to get the accelerator and the clutch to get right. They want to engage with the relationship, and they want to sort of take the foot off their sort of pain, but they can't let it go ultimately. So they're just trying to get that right biting point. And I think a big thing that connects a lot of the stories is the question of loyalty. Lauren was very loyal, Panenka's first wife, very loyal to him in a way that she didn't really get the dividend from that. Marie-Therese has a certain, ultimately, I think her relationship with Panenka comes down to a question of loyalty, both from him to her and her back to him then later. I think Esther and Panenka's a similar question as well about what does it mean for their relationship, and also for Vincent, and friendship, and then of course the bigger question of the town's loyalty, to the football team and to the people who play there. The line about the fans were famous for being loyal up until the point when they weren't. So I think when you're, as so often happens in relationships, you don't know what's going to happen next. You don't have the information to know what the right decision. Even if you were a wise person, even if you'd been reincarnated a million times and you knew what to do, you never have the information. So you're always gambling. And there's a sort of sense that when it comes to the big decisions in life, they're made in sort of real time. And sometimes those big conversations or those big decisions, you do get them wrong and you don't get a chance to have them again. And to some extent, Panenka does get a second bite at some of that.
I was wondering at this point, could I invite anyone in the audience? Does anyone have any questions or comments for Rónán?
I'd love to ask.
Yeah.
For me, the most endearing part of the book was the relationship with the grandson. And could you just tell us a little more about why did you weave him into the story, or did that happen accidentally, or?
Yeah, so people who don't know, Panenka lives with Marie-Therese's estranged daughter, and they've connected again, and she has a 7-year-old son, Arthur. And I suppose part of me just wanted to write a child character. I wanted to have what I hoped was a sort of realistic child character, particularly because my kids are constantly giving out that the children they read in books don't exist. They don't find they're realistic. And I want to try and sort of express that sort of gentle side to Panenka and to Vincent as well, who's Arthur's father. And I just think it's a really beautiful dynamic. I've sort of seen so many examples just of people I know where there's a real, particularly with men, a sort of softness and a gentleness with grandchildren. And as such a sort of carefree expression of love that people have, there just seems to be more doubt over the parent-child relationship. And I just want this sort of show, I didn't want Panenka just to be a sort of a functional sort of, I'm a pain robot going on and, I'm going to sort of say that he actually does have that sort of softer, sort of loving side. And I really like writing chemistry. I like writing chemistry between characters. And I thought that was just an interesting, the power dynamic is
so beautifully portrayed, though.
Oh, thank you, Corey.
Like Arthur really lives in the moment, in terms of his world and just interactions, and he has that memorable line, when he's been asked, I think it's by his father, why do people always want to ask if I'm being bullied, And you had a song on your last album, What If My Children Get Bullied? Yeah. Is this a constant kind of, theme or kind of concern?
Yeah, like that song is an instrumental song.
Yeah.
And I was trying to think, what will I call it? And I was like, with any creative thing, you always just sort of stop and you say, what is really going on inside me? What is the thought that keeps cycling around that I'm not aware of? And that was the question, what if my children get bullied? Whenever you read a lot of children's books, it's not uncommon to have an outsider child who's being bullied, and the bully either, the tables are turned. There's loads of films that, and our kids are constantly giving out about that fact, as if they're just being stereotyped as either bullies or victims of bullies. So, there's lots of these sort of moments where Arthur is with his mother, his father, his grandfather, and just when things get quiet, it's when the adults like to slip in an important question, is everything okay at school? And he's like, I really hate when you do that. You agree to take advantage of the intimacy. And he's like, why are you so obsessed with bullies? They're just kids. So he just tries to put it back. I think with children, you have to be careful. They can't be too sort of, oh, wow, look at that leaf. Isn't the world amazing? Or nor can they be the wise child. They're both sort of stereotypes that adults are kind of comfortable with. So I just want them to have, because I find my kids are 10 and 12 now, and they're quite tuned in, and they really see through things. I never use. It was tempting sometimes to use their funny one-liners in the book, but what I found in the past is sometimes they make me laugh with something, and then I find that it's a quote from a movie or something that I haven't seen. So it's just I have to be careful, just thinking that they're shameless about ripping other people off. So I can't reuse their stuff, but I try to get the spirit of their banter into the book.
So did you run a lot of Arthur's dialogue with road test it with them?
No, although I've promised my son Jacob, who's more or less the prototype for Arthur, I said I would at one stage I'd read him out what Arthur says, because he sort of became aware of this. That he was being used, or in that sort of way. So no, I didn't sort of test it with them, because what they would like to see, they would always feel that books that they kind of stopped reading fiction actually, because the stuff they talk about and the language they use they see in YouTube but they don't see in books, because the stuff in books is all PG, and the stuff they talk about is their bodies and with the vocabulary to go with that, which wouldn't work in book publishing, I don't think, for young kids.
Yeah. Well,
or maybe be a sensation, I don't know.
Yeah. Does anyone have another question for Rónán? I suppose the timing as well. We have a big match tomorrow night. What your thoughts on the Euros?
I have my marketing team on standby in case somebody takes a Panenka. Like every time there's a penalty shootout, my sort of Twitter notifications go through the roof and that kind of stuff. I've really enjoyed it. I find, because I work full time and I write, and sometimes I think my life can get very serious, you know. So I do like that about football and the Euros, where it kind of really matters and then it kind of doesn't matter either. So I've enjoyed and because it's in Europe, the match times have been quite humane. Next year being Qatar, I don't know what time the games will be on it.
Yeah.
No, I've really enjoyed it, and I know everyone gives out about England, but the longer they're in it, there's definitely more fun when they're in it, I think. You know, there's definitely more buzz and so on, but I'd be slightly preferring Italy tomorrow, I'm afraid. Very
good. Well, Rónán Hession, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And as Emer said at the start, he has copies of his wonderful book. And I suppose if you'd like it signed, you're very welcome. Rónán, thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.